What's going on, old school scares? Welcome back to the channel, and today we have a pretty cool, exciting list I'm super happy to share with you. We're going to talk about the top 10 deaths in horror history. Now, I want to have a huge caveat here. This is my opinion. Nobody else's. Your death scenes will be different than mine, but these are the scenes that always stood out to me and really got me into loving horror. When you think about horror movies, to me, it's, the story's always been important, the acting, everything that goes into it, the scares, the atmosphere. But let's face it, we always watch the horror movies to see how creative and different the death scenes can be in the movie. That's the most exciting part. So what I want to do is I want to share my top 10 of all time with you. But I have one ask first. If you haven't done so far, please hit that like and subscribe button. Let's get into the list. Now, as we set this list up, I'm doing it in chronological order from oldest to newest. It's not a rated from 1 to 10. They're all incredible death scenes to me. And there are tons, obviously, we've left off of here. But again, these are my opinion of the top 10. We're going to start all the way back in 1931 with Frankenstein. This was a movie as a kid I loved, and actually as a kid, Frankenstein scared the hell out of me. I love this movie. I think it's super well done. I mean, Bride is arguably a better movie, but there's such an iconic death scene in this movie, and it's the scene where Maria, the little girl, gets killed by the monster. The monster comes up to her at the edge of the water. She's throwing flowers into the water, and when they run out of flowers, the monster wanting to continue to play with her, doesn't have any concept of what he's going to do, and he throws her into the water. And the crazy thing in this is this scene was censored heavily back in the day. And what happens if you actually watch the scene, he continues to throw her until she drowns. They make it very, ambiguous as they shot it, right? You just see him by the water and the little girl's dead. So it actually makes it seem like it's a whole heck of a lot worse than it was. But this scene's just awesome. It really sets the pace for the movie. And the movie isn't incredibly graphic or gory. But to see back then, especially in the 30s, a kid being killed on screen was super rare. And it really was kind of the launch of these great iconic monster movies. Look, I love Dracula. I love, Creature, Wolfman. But Frankenstein, especially back in the day, was probably the most iconic of all the movie monsters. And you just see him right away, and you have that expectation of what he's going to look like. So our second movie we're going to talk about is Psycho from 1960. I'm not going to go super deep into this scene. I don't think I need to. Obviously, Marion Crane's death at the hands of Norman Bates as mother in the shower. Man, there's been a million stories, a million articles written on this. Hitchcock and what he did, shooting in black and white, killing off, the star of the movie in the first, 45 minutes, using the chocolate syrup for the effect. I mean, the shot of the eyeball at the end with the water going down. It just doesn't. Nothing more needs to be said. It's literally one of the most iconic scenes in the history of horror movies. Our next movie we're going to go to is 1968. We're going to go to Night of the Living Dead, George Romero's classic movie. And this scene always freaked me out because my dad told me it freaked him out. And from my dad, he loved horror movies. We used to watch them together. Him and my mom, very different. My dad was a slasher guy. My mom was like the monster movie type person. But they gave me my love for horror movies. And when I was watching them, I would think back to, the 68 with Romero. The scene where Karen, the little girl, turns into a zombie. And her mother comes downstairs after a ton of the chaos upstairs. And she kills her mother with that garden trowel. Her mom was Helen, and she gets killed with that garden trowel. Holy cow, in that scene, right? There's this crazy music in the background. It's super creepy and eerie. And that scene always stood out to me. Again, my dad said it was a scene that always freaked him out. And for me, my dad, we used to watch all the 80s monster movies or slasher movies together. Nothing freaked him out, and that was the one that did. So I went back and watched it, and again, watching it more recently, it definitely is more impactful today than it was even all those years ago. So such a really cool scene. All right, so now we come out of the black and white era and we get into the color era. And our next two movies, the next two death scenes are going to both come from 1979. Our first is going to come from Alien. Again, shouldn't surprise anybody. One of the most iconic scenes of all time. The iconic chestburster scene where Kane goes out, discovers the eggs, get attacked by the face hugger. They bring him back on the ship against Ripley's wishes, right, not following protocol. And everything seems to be normal. And they have this whole dinner scene. John Hurt plays Kane. And he's just sitting there. He starts to choke, and they think he's choking on his food. And all of a sudden, and this was the coolest part of this death scene for me as you read more about it, they didn't tell the rest of the cast what was going to happen. So when the blood comes out, it actually hits the other characters in the face. They're shocked. And it really plays well on screen. And again, this is one of those scenes that has to be one of the most iconic of all time. It was parodied in a ton of movies. The Young Frankenstein movie with the monster dancing, the chest burster. So a really cool, iconic scene. Our next is going to be 1979's Zombie or Zombie 2. It's rated a whole bunch of different ways. Luciano Fulci's, and I think I may have pronounced it wrong. If I apologize if I did. But his iconic scene, and this is probably one of the most iconic death scenes, especially from any of those slasher movies from the Italian cinema at the time. But there's a scene where Paula, who's the doctor's wife, they're on an island experimenting, and she wants to leave the island, and the doctor doesn't want to let her leave, and basically the zombie punches through the door, creates a splinter. And this was one of the first scenes that really grossed me out as a kid, and it horrified me. I hated it. Because anything with the eye is just so gross. And Paula basically gets pulled into a splinter, and the splinter goes right through her eyeball. And it just still right now, it still gives me just chills. It's so nasty. It's just such an iconic scene, and you see it, and it kind of takes you back to those, the Italian, Gallo movies where you have a ton of blood, and it's just over the top. And that's one of the best death scenes out there. What I'm going to go to now is one of my favorite franchises of all time, and I'm probably going to pick a different kill than most of you guys would in this franchise. There's a ton of really cool death scenes. It could be Jason's death in the final chapter. It could be the cryogenic head death in Jason X. There's a ton of really cool death scenes. A sleeping bag death scene. But for me, my favorite scene, and I think the one that stands out the most, and this is from 1981's Friday the 13th Part 2, is Mark's death in the wheelchair. Mark is this really cool wheelchair, bound character, had an accident, wants to kind of come back, great shape, just a really likable, iconic character. And there's just a really brutal death scene where he gets hit in the face with a machete, and then he rolls back down like tons of stairs that flashes to a white flash that cuts out. And it always stood out to me as the coolest death scene in that movie. I think I've told you before, Friday 2 is by far my favorite Friday movie. And there's some really cool death scenes, the claw hammer to the back of the head, Mark's death. I just really like Friday. I think it's the best of the Friday movies in my personal opinion, because I think Baghead Jason is the scariest out of all the Jason movies. Also from the Halloween franchise, so 1982, Halloween 3. I'm going to have a Halloween death on here, and it's not a Michael Myers kill. Shocking, right? But I love Halloween 3. I've told you guys that a bunch of times. I think it's criminally underrated. And this movie is ridiculous with some of the death scenes. You have the mask that explodes into the face of the journalist, and her mouth melts, and the bugs come out, and wow, that's a crazy scene. But little Buddy's death, his parents are the top salespeople. They bring him in, which also was always stupid to me. I guess if you're gonna kill the world, all these kids in the world, I guess it doesn't matter if you get rid of your top salesperson. You're not worried about your numbers the next year. But I always wondered why they brought in the best salesperson and his family to test this on. But they test the device. They have the piece of Stonehenge in the back of the mask. And basically when they test it and use the Silver Shamrock jingle, little Buddy's head starts to melt. The mask starts to melt. His head starts to melt. Bugs and snakes and all this stuff come out, and they come out and kill his parents in the room. It's just a crazy over-the-top death scene that I absolutely love. I think it's so well done. I think it's so crazy and creepy and scary. Again, one of my absolute favorites. All right, we're coming into the home stretch, and now we get into 1985. We have another Romero movie, Day of the Dead. I think this is the weakest of the trilogy, and there's a ton of great deaths in Dawn that we could have put in here too. But I think the most iconic death scene, and I think this is where Savini really came into his own as a special effects artist. There's so many death scenes I could have put in from Savini in here. The exploding head in Maniac, which freaked me out as a kid. But I think he really came into his own in Day, and I think the death scene that stands out, and I think it'd be the same for most of us, would be Rhodes' death. Rhodes is the leader in this little underground bunker. The world's been taken over by zombies. And he gets attacked by Bub, who is one of the zombies that's kind of been trained by one of the doctors to be passive or domesticated, if you will, which was kind of a cool concept that was really taken to another level in Fido later on down the road. But Bub realizes that Rhodes has killed the doctor, and he goes out for revenge, shoots him, and as Rhodes is trying to escape, he opens the door, and there's just a ton of zombies there. And this is that iconic scene where Rhodes gets ripped in half, and they're eating his guts. And he just says, choke on him, choke on him. It's so cool. Like, if you've seen the scene, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's the most memorable part of that movie, and I think the best death scene out of all of the original trilogy of the Living Dead movies by Romero. Our next movie to me is near and dear to my heart. I think it's this movie, this death scene, I think brought back horror. We were kind of going in a weird direction, and this is going to be Casey Becker's death in 1996 Scream. Very similar to Marion Crane's death, right? You know, Drew Barrymore was one of the top billed stars and probably the most famous person in this movie at the time. And you know, to have her death come at the beginning of the movie was absolutely a shock. I remember seeing this in the theater with my one of my best friends at the time and his future wife, and she hated us for it because she hated horror movies. That movie scared the hell out of her. And you know, we were in our early, I want to say I was 22 when that movie came out, maybe 23. She was probably the similar age. You know, we were just outside of the demographic of what the movie was, and it was just awesome. It just was such a great, iconic scene. And then her death scene is brutal. I've talked about it before in my Scream review, but man, like, her scene is pretty rough. I mean, it's 4 or 5 minutes long, but then when she just gets gutted at the end and she's on the phone with her parents and her mom hears her, basically breathing her last breath, it's a pretty rough, brutal death. The last one I have on here is my favorite horror movie of the last, probably call it 10 years or so, is Cabin in the Woods from 2012. And it's Stephen Hadley's death, played by Bradley Woodford, who I've hated as a character. He's great at what he does since Happy Gilmore. He was such a jerk in that movie. But his whole thing in this movie is that, you know, they're trying to figure out which monsters the kids are going to choose to be sacrificed to, because they make their own choice in the cabin. And he's really just hoping it's going to be the merman. And he's like, I just always wanted once to see the merman in action. And as all hell breaks loose and everybody escapes and all the monsters get loose from their containment, he gets injured in an explosion. He's on the ground. He can't move. And this really slow, plodding merman comes up. And he's like, oh, come on. And the merman just starts eating his face alive and blood spewing out of the blowhole. Man, it's really cool. It's well done. It's a cool monster. I love this scene. I think the movie's so good, and there's so many cool monsters in that movie. To me, that's the one that stood out that I really liked the most. So for me, guys, that's my top 10 death scenes of all time in horror movie history. I'd love to hear in the comments below what your favorite death scenes are. Kind of share it with us. But with that being said, like we always say, stay scary, and we'll talk to you really soon. Thanks.